Alright, last time we configured the store and connected it into our React application. In this part, we're going to create our first model and display a list of users. We're going to start by creating a new users.ts file for our users model. It is a good practice to have a separate file for each of your models, since those can become quite big. But before we go any further, let's talk about what model actually is. Model is a special rematch abstraction that hides smaller details of Redux. To see how it works, let's look at this simple example. Here we have a pure Redux reducer. For a state there is a number, and then we can increment or decrement it by a certain value. And a lot of code here is dedicated to defining and then parsing actions using their string-based names. Instead of doing that, Rematch has a separate named reducer function for every action. So now that we know what model is, let's actually create one. So I'm going to create a new model variable, and then I'm gonna export it. So first we need to define a property called state, which is the initial state that the model is in. In our case, it's gonna be just an empty array. We also want to let TypeScript know that we have an array of users here. So I'm going to import user type from common types, and then I'm going to define a local state type, which is going to be a read-only array of users. And we want to use a read-only array here because our state should never be mutated, and read-only type will make sure that we never mutate our state. So now we can annotate our state as state. Great. So next we're going to define our reducers. And we'll need to define two of them, one for loading users and one for following or unfollowing users. We'll start with the one called loaded, which is going to be a function that takes the current state, which will be of type state, and a payload, and it's going to return the next state. Note that this is going to be a common function signature for all of our reducers, with the state being the first argument and payload being the second one. And remember that if you need to pass more than one value to your reducers, always combine them into one payload object. So our loaded reducer is going to receive a read-only array of users as a payload, and as for state transformation, we just want to return whatever payload we got. The second reducer that we need is going to be called follow toggled, and it's going to receive current state as the first argument and payload, which in this case is going to be a user object for which we want to toggle isFollowing property. Since we don't want to mutate our original state, I'm going to map over it, and if we find a user with a matching ID, then we're going to return a new user with the isFollowing property inverted. And otherwise, we just want to return user. All right, everything looks good. So now we can open our index.ts file with global store configuration. And I'm going to import our users model that we've just created and add it to our models object. Great. Now we're going to switch to the browser with Redux DevTools open, and if we inspect our global state, we're going to see that now it has users property that is an empty array. Now it's time to connect the users model to our first component and display a list of users. So I'm going to create a new containers folder for our connected components, and then I'm going to add a new users component. I'm going to import React from React, and we're also going to need user list component from components user list. So our users component is going to be a stateless functional component. When it mounts, we want to call our loaded reducer function to load the list of users. And to do that, we're going to use an effect hook. Finally, we want to return the user list component, passing it an array of users and the toggle follow function. We don't have access to any of those yet, so now it's time to connect our users component to the store. So first I'm going to import connect method from React Redux, and down below we're going to export connected version of our users component. Now we just need to pass map props function that is going to get an array of users from the store, and map dispatch function that will map our loaded and follow toggled reducer functions. Before we do that, we want to define two types that are going to help us have better type safety inside map props and map dispatch function. So I'm going to open our store configuration file, and from Rematch core package we want to import two special types: Rematch root state and Rematch dispatch. These are generic types that can infer the shape of our state, as well as all reducer functions based on the model's object. So down here I'm going to export a new type called root state that is going to be equal to Rematch root state type of models. And the second one is going to be called root dispatch, and it's going to be Rematch dispatch type of models. Now we can import types we've just defined and use them inside map store and map dispatch functions. So our map props function is going to take a state which is going to be of type root state, and it's going to return an object with a single property called users, which we're going to map from state users model. And as you can see, TypeScript already knows that users is going to be a read-only array of user, which is exactly what we want. And our map dispatch function is going to take dispatch of type root dispatch, and it's going to return an object with two properties, one called loaded, which is going to be dispatch users loaded function, and the second is going to be follow toggled, which we can map from dispatch users follow toggled. It's important to note that to prevent type errors in map dispatch function, we need to disable strict function types setting in tsconfig.json file. The reason is that map dispatch function in connect method expects an argument to be of type Redux dispatch, whereas we pass in it an argument of type Rematch dispatch, which is an intersection of Rematch dispatcher and Redux dispatch. Disabled strict function type setting allows for bivariant function parameter type checking, and we don't get an error here. So back to our users component, we're going to define its props type. The props are going to contain a union of values returned by map props and map dispatch function. So we need to create a new users props type, which is going to be an intersection type of return type of map props, and return type of map dispatch. Then we can use a generic functional component type from React package and pass it our users props. With that in place, we can destructure our props object and get all the properties that we need. So I'm going to pass users down here, our follow toggled function down here, and inside of the effects hook we can call loaded method. When calling loaded function, we need to pass it an array of actual users. In the next part, we're going to connect to Real API to retrieve a list of users, but for now, we're just going to import a hard-coded list of users from common users, and we'll pass it down here. Now we're pretty much done with this component, so now we just need to open app.tsx file, import our users component from containers users, and we can use it in place of unconnected user list component down below. So if now we switch to the browser, we can already see a list of users shown on the page. We can click follow button and we can see that users follow toggled action is firing and it is properly reflected in the UI. And if we inspect the raw state, we're going to see that our users property in a global state now has 3 user items. All right, to finish this up, let's also quickly create a connected header component. So I'm going to create a new index.ts file, and we're going to need a connect method from React Redux package and unconnected header component from components header. As we can see, header component expects a single property called count. So what we can do is we can create a new map props function that is going to take the state, and we're going to return an object with a single property called count, which is going to be equal to state users. And now we want to filter only those users who have their isFollowing flag set to true, and then we need to get their count. Now we just need to export our connected component, go into app.tsx file, and instead of importing unconnected header from components, we're going to use one from containers, and we don't need to pass count property since it's being injected by the store. Going back to the browser, we can follow a few users, and we can see that follow counts in the header updates as expected. And this is it for this part. In the next one, we're going to see how we can work with side effects in Rematch, and we'll connect to Real API to load a list of users.